On a June morning in 2009, every pasture in Saline County, Missouri, had gone the color of old straw. The creek beds were cracked, the cattle were restless, and, in the middle of it all, one field along the county road sat green. Not the pale, struggling green of something barely hanging on. A deep, living green. The kind of green that makes you slow your truck down and look twice. The field belonged to a 23-year-old woman named Greta Salazar, and 3 years before that drought, every person in Saline County who knew her name had laughed at her. Let me tell you how that happened. Let me tell you about Saline County, Missouri, in the early 2000s, because you need to understand the place before you can understand the woman who changed it. Saline County sits in the middle of the state, west of the Missouri River, in the kind of country that looks like it was ironed flat by a patient hand. The land is good, deeply good. The topsoil runs dark and rich for 2 feet in places, and the farmers who work it have known for generations that if you put something in the ground here, it will grow. The question was never whether the land could produce. The question was what you put in it, and nobody in Saline County had questioned that in a very long time. The answer, for as long as anyone could remember, was feed. Tall feed, specifically. Kentucky 31, the variety that had been planted across the Ozarks and the Missouri River Valley since the 1940s, when the university extension agents came through in their trucks and told every farmer in the county that this was the grass that would hold their pastures together. And they were right, in the way that people are right when they are solving one problem without seeing the next 3. Tall fescue held the soil. It came back after a hard winter. It tolerated a wet spring. It was, by every measure the extension agents used, the correct answer. So every farmer in Saline County planted it. And then their sons planted it, and then their sons planted it. By 2003, if you drove any county road in Saline County from April through September, you would see the same grass on every farm, in every pasture, on every hillside and bottom ground and creek bank. Tall fescue, green and reliable and everywhere. It was not a decision anymore. It was geography. It was the shape of the land itself. Let me tell you about the Salazar family, because they were as much a part of that landscape as anyone. Hector Salazar had farmed 640 acres in the eastern part of the county since 1981, when he bought the first 200 acres with money borrowed from his father and a loan from the Farm Credit Office in Marshall. He ran a cow-calf operation, 180 head of Angus cross cattle, and he did it the way every serious farmer in the county did it. He managed his fescue pastures carefully. He rotated his cattle through paddocks on a schedule he had worked out over 20 years of watching what the land told him. He kept his fences tight and his records tighter. He was not a flashy man. He was a methodical one, and his operation showed it. His wean-in weights were consistent. His conception rates were solid. His calves sold well at the Marshall sale barn every October, and he came home from those sales with enough to make his payments and put a little aside. Hector Salazar was a good farmer. He had never been anything else. His daughter Greta grew up on those 640 acres the way farm kids do, which is to say, she grew up working. She knew how to pull a calf before she was 12. She could read a cow's condition score by eye at 14. She knew which paddocks ran wet in the spring and which ones dried out first in August, and she knew it the way you know things that are built into you before you can name them. But she also noticed things that nobody else in the county seemed to notice, or at least nobody talked about. She noticed that her father's cattle lost weight every summer, even in years when the fescue was plentiful. She noticed that the cow's feet swelled in the heat. She noticed that conception rates dropped in July and August, year after year, like a clock. She noticed that her father's best pastures, the ones he was most careful with, still seemed to produce cattle that were just a little bit less than what they should have been. She filed those observations away the way a certain kind of person files things, not in a drawer, but in the back of the mind where they stay warm and keep working. In the fall of 2002, Greta Salazar left Saline County for the University of Missouri in Columbia. She was 18 years old, and she had a partial scholarship and a notebook she had bought at the farm and fleet in Marshall. She intended to study animal science, and she did. But in her second year, she took an elective course in plant ecology that her advisor had suggested mostly to fill a credit requirement, and the professor of that course was a man named Dr. Leonard Voss, who had spent 30 years studying the grassland ecosystems of the Great Plains and the Missouri River Valley, and who had opinions about tall fescue that were not popular at extension offices. Let me tell you about what Dr. Voss taught her, because it is the reason this story exists. Tall fescue, Kentucky 31 specifically, is infected in almost every stand in Missouri with a naturally occurring fungus called an endophyte. The endophyte lives inside the grass plant and produces alkaloids, chemical compounds that make the grass tough and persistent and resistant to insects and drought. Those same alkaloids, when cattle eat the grass, cause a condition called fescue toxicosis. The alkaloids constrict blood vessels. They reduce the cattle's ability to regulate body temperature. They suppress the hormones that govern reproduction. They cause the feet to swell and, in severe cases, to slough off entirely, a condition called fescue foot. The cattle stand in water to cool themselves. They lose weight, they breed poorly, they wean lighter calves, and the farmers who own them look at the numbers and assume they are doing something wrong, or that the year was hard, or that this is simply what cattle do in summer. Dr. Voss had a different explanation. He had data from university trials going back to 1978 showing that cattle on endophyte-infected fescue weaned calves that were, on average, 40 to 60 pounds lighter than cattle on endophyte-free pastures. He had conception rate data showing a 15 to 20% reduction in herds grazing infected fescue during peak alkaloid months, which were July and August, exactly the months when Greta had noticed her father's conception rates falling. He had economic models showing that a 640-acre cow-calf operation in central Missouri was leaving between $18,000 and $34,000 per year on the table due to fescue toxicosis, depending on calf prices and herd size. He had all of this data, and he had been presenting it at extension meetings for 15 years, and the farmers of Saline County had heard it and nodded and gone home and not changed a single thing, because the alternative he proposed was not simple. The alternative was to kill the fesk and replace it with native warm-season grasses, big bluestem, Indian grass, switchgrass. The grasses that had covered the Missouri River Valley before European settlement, that had fed the bison herds that once moved across this country in numbers that are now almost impossible to imagine. These grasses had deep root systems, some running 10 to 15 feet into the soil, compared to fescue's 2 to 3 feet. They were drought-tolerant in a way that fescue was not, because they had evolved here over 10,000 years, and knew the soil and the weather in a way that an imported European grass never could. They produced high-quality forage during the hottest months of summer, July and August, exactly when fescue's alkaloid content peaked and cattle refused to graze it. They were, by Dr. Voss's data, superior to fescue in almost every measurable way for a Missouri cow-calf operation. The reason nobody planted them was simple. Killing established fescue was expensive. Replanting native grass was slow. You could not graze a newly seeded native grass stand for 2 full years. The upfront cost of herbicide, seed, and lost grazing was significant. And the farmers of Saline County were practical men who had learned to be suspicious of university professors telling them to do expensive things that would not pay off for 3 years. Greta Salazar sat in Dr. Voss's classroom and felt something click into place that had been loose for years. She came home for Christmas her junior year with a notebook full of data and a proposal she had been working on since October. She waited until the second night, after supper, when her mother Rosa had poured coffee, and her father Hector was sitting at the kitchen table with the look he got when he was willing to listen. She laid the notebook on the table. She explained the endophyte. She explained the alkaloids. She explained the weaning weight data and the conception rate data and the economic model she had built using her father's own records, which she had gone through in the filing cabinet in his office the afternoon she arrived. She showed him that his herd was performing almost exactly where Dr. Voss's model predicted an endophyte-infected fescue operation would perform. She showed him that if she was right, he was losing somewhere between $22,000 and $28,000 per year. The kitchen went quiet. Rosa stopped refilling the coffee cups. Hector set down his fork, which was a thing he did not do until he was finished eating, and he was not finished eating. He looked at the notebook for a long time. He looked at his records, which Greta had annotated in the margins in red pen. He looked at the window, which showed nothing but the December dark. He said he needed to think about it. That was not a no. In the Salazar house, that was not a no. He thought about it for 6 weeks. In February, he told Greta that when she came home in May, she could have the south 100 acres, the old bottom-ground pasture that ran along the creek and had always been his worst-performing ground, and she could do what she wanted with it. He would pay for the herbicide application. She would manage the rest. If it worked, they would talk about more ground. If it did not, they would not discuss it again. Greta came home in May 2004 with her degree 3 months away, and a plan she had been refining since February. She applied glyphosate to the south 100 acres in 2 passes, 2 weeks apart, to kill the fescue. She ordered seed from a native grass supplier in Kansas City, a mix of big blue stem, Indian grass, and side oats grama, chosen for their performance data in Missouri river bottom soils. She drilled the seed in late May with a no-till drill borrowed from the county extension office. She put up temporary fencing and posted the pasture against grazing. She made a sign on a piece of plywood and nailed it to the fence post at the county road. The sign said, "Native Grass Restoration. Year 1. No grazing." Now let me tell you about Dale Crowley, because you need to understand him before you can understand what he said. Dale Crowley was 58 years old in 2004 and had been the primary cattle dealer and livestock buyer for the eastern half of Saline County for 22 years. He bought calves at the Marshall sale barn. He brokered background and contracts, and he held court at the Cenex Co-op in Napton every Tuesday and Thursday morning, where the farmers of the county gathered to drink bad coffee and talk about prices and weather and each other's business. Dale Crowley knew everyone's operation. He knew their acreage and their herd sizes and their weaning weights going back 15 years. He was not a bad man. He was a certain kind of man, the kind whose certainty about how things work has been confirmed so many times by experience that it has become indistinguishable from knowledge. He had watched 100 young people come back from college with ideas that did not survive contact with an actual farm, and he had learned to identify the type. When Greta's sign appeared on the county road fence post, Dale Crowley drove past it on a Tuesday morning. He mentioned it at the co-op. He said, "Hector Salazar's girl's out there killing his best creek bottom pasture and planting prairie grass." He said it the way you say something that explains itself. He let the room sit with it for a moment. Then he said, "I guess they're teaching something new down in Columbia." The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then the room started laughing. Not mean laughter. That is important to understand. It was the laughter of men who had seen things tried and fail, who had learned to protect themselves from disappointment by laughing at the thing before it could hurt them. It was the laughter of people who knew the land and believed they knew it completely, and who could not imagine that a 22-year-old woman with a notebook knew something they did not. Dale Crowley's smile was wide and comfortable. He said that native grass was fine for quail hunters and conservation programs, but that a working cattle operation needed grass that produced, and that fescue had been producing in this county for 60 years, and that Hector Salazar was going to be looking at a bare dirt field for 2 years and then a weedy mess for 2 more, and that the girl would be back in Columbia or Kansas City or wherever young people went when the farm didn't work out. One of the men at the counter, a farmer named Bud Thornton, who ran 90 head on the farm adjoining the Salazar South pasture, asked if anyone had talked to Hector about it. Dale Crowley said Hector was a sensible man, and probably had his reasons, but that sensible men sometimes let sentiment get ahead of sense when it came to their kids. That Tuesday morning at the Cenex Co-op in Napton, Missouri, in the spring of 2004, not one man in that room thought Greta Salazar was going to prove anything except that native grass was a nice idea that didn't pay. Let me tell you what Greta was doing while they were laughing. She was not at the co-op. She was in the south pasture with a soil probe and a notebook, taking baseline measurements. She had divided the 100-acre field into a grid of 20 sampling points and was recording soil temperature, soil moisture, and organic matter readings that she would compare against the same points in future years. She had set up a weather station on a fence post at the field center, a small electronic unit that recorded temperature, humidity, and rainfall every hour. She had photographed every corner of the field from fixed points she marked with rebar stakes, so she could document the visual change over time. She was building a record that nobody had asked her to build, for a case she had not yet been asked to make, in front of an audience that had not yet agreed to listen. Her mother brought her lunch in a paper bag at noon. Rosa Salazar stood at the fence and watched her daughter move through the field with the soil probe and said, "Dale Crowley is telling people you're ruining the pasture." Greta looked up from her notebook. She said, "I know." Rosa said, "Your father heard about it." Greta said, "I know that too." Rosa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She's right, you know," which was a thing she said to Hector that evening at supper, and which Hector received without comment, which in the Salazar house meant he had already decided the same thing, but was not ready to say it. The first summer was ugly. Native grass seedlings are not impressive in their first year. They spend most of their energy building root systems, and the above-ground growth is sparse and weedy-looking. Bud Thornton drove past the south pasture in July and stopped his truck and looked at the field for a long time and then drove on without saying anything. A man named Wes Sievert, who farmed 400 acres 3 miles north and had known Hector Salazar for 30 years, stopped by the house in August and asked Hector quietly if everything was all right, if the girl needed help, if maybe the project had gotten away from her. Hector said everything was fine. He said it in a tone that ended the conversation. The first full growing season produced almost nothing in terms of forage. That was expected. What it produced, invisibly, was root mass. Big Blue Stem in its first year will put down roots 4 to 6 feet deep before it shows much above the soil surface. Indian grass does the same. The plants were building infrastructure that nobody could see, and Greta photographed the soil probe holes to document it, and wrote the root depth measurements in her notebook, and waited. In the spring of 2005, the South pasture woke up. Let me tell you about the spring of 2005, because it is the first time the numbers started to talk. The Big Blue Stem came up in April, thick and dark green, in stands that surprised even Greta with their density. The Indian grass followed 2 weeks later, tall and upright, with the blue-green color that distinguishes it from every other grass on the landscape. By June, the South pasture was waist-high in places, a mix of species that moved in the wind the way fescue never did, in waves with a texture and variety that looked nothing like the uniform carpet of the county's other pastures. Greta opened the temporary fencing in late June and moved 40 of her father's cows onto the field, keeping careful records of the date, the animals' weights, and their body condition scores. She pulled them off in early August after 45 days of grazing and weighed every animal. The cows that had spent the summer on the native grass pasture had gained an average of 1.8 pounds per day during the grazing period. The cows on the farm's fescue pastures had gained an average of 0.9 pounds per day during the same period. The conception check in September showed a 94% conception rate in the native grass group. The fescue group was at 78%, which was actually slightly above the farm's historical average, meaning it was a good year for the fescue cattle and still not close to the native grass cattle. Greta wrote the numbers in her notebook, and then she built a spreadsheet on the computer in her father's office and ran the revenue projections. The 40 cows on native grass, if they maintained that performance through weaning, would produce calves averaging 50 to 65 pounds heavier than the fescue calves. At the previous year's calf price of $1.12 per pound, that was $56 to $73 per calf, times 40 calves, which was $2,240 to $2,920 in additional revenue from 100 acres. And that was before accounting for the improved conception rate, which meant more calves to sell, and it was before accounting for the reduction in veterinary costs from fescue toxicosis, which had cost the operation $3,400 the previous year in foot treatments and reproductive interventions. She put the spreadsheet on the kitchen table. Hector looked at it for a long time. He looked at it the same way he had looked at the first notebook, with the focused stillness of a man who is checking every number against what he knows. He got up and went to his filing cabinet and pulled out his sale barn receipts from October and checked the weaning weights against what Greta had projected. He sat back down. He said, "How much ground do you need?" She said, "All of it, eventually, but let's do the North 80 next spring." He said, "The North 80 is my best fescue ground." She said, "I know. That's why the numbers will be even better." He looked at the spreadsheet again. He looked at his hands. He said, "Plant the North 80. Let me tell you about the spring of 2006, because this is where the county started paying attention whether it wanted to or not. The North 80 went into native grass in May 2006. Greta had refined her seeding mix based on the first year's results, adding a higher proportion of big blue stem and reducing the side oats grama, which had performed adequately but not as well as the blue stem in the river bottom soil. She also added eastern gamma grass to the mix, a species Dr. Voss had mentioned in an email she had sent him in January, asking for his recommendations for her specific soil type and rainfall pattern. He had written back 3 pages of notes and attached 2 unpublished data sets from trials in central Missouri. She incorporated his recommendations and drilled the seed in the 3rd week of May. By this point, the South pasture was in its 2nd full production year and performing beyond the first year's numbers. The cows that had grazed it the previous summer came through the winter in better condition than any group on the farm in Hector's memory. Their hair coats were cleaner, their feet were sound. They cycled earlier in the spring. The February pregnancy check showed a 96% conception rate in the group that had spent the summer on native grass, and Hector stood in the barn looking at that number on the clipboard for a long moment before he handed it back to the veterinarian without saying anything. At the Cenex Co-op in Napton, Dale Crowley had heard the rumors, farmers' talk, and Bud Thornton had mentioned the cow's condition to someone, and that someone had mentioned it to someone else, and by March 2006 there was a version of the story circulating at the co-op that was half accurate and half speculation. Dale Crowley's response was to drive past the Salazar South pasture on a Tuesday morning and look at it, and what he saw was a field that looked like nothing else in the county. A tall, varied, moving stand of grass that was clearly healthy and clearly not fescue, and he drove to the co-op and told the men there that Hector's girl had gotten lucky with her first year, and that one good year didn't prove anything, and that the real test would come when they had a dry summer. He said, "Wait for a dry summer. Then we'll see what that prairie grass does." He said it with the confidence of a man who believes he is right and is willing to wait to be proven so. He did not have to wait long. Let me tell you about the summer of 2007, because it was the first real test, and it was not the last. June of 2007 was dry. Not catastrophically dry, but dry enough that the fescue pastures in Saline County began to show stress by the 3rd week of the month, the tips going yellow, the growth slowing, the cattle grazing harder and finding less. Hector's fescue pastures showed the same stress as his neighbors. His native grass pastures did not. The big blue stem and Indian grass in the south pasture and the newly established North 80 drew on root systems that now ran 8 to 10 feet into the soil, reaching moisture that the fescue's shallow roots could not access. The native grass stayed green through June and into July while the fescue went dormant. Greta's cattle grazed the native grass paddocks on a rotation she managed daily, moving animals every 2 to 3 days to allow recovery, and the grass kept coming. It kept producing. It kept feeding cattle through a month when her neighbors were feeding hay they had put up for winter. Bud Thornton burned through 40 round bales in July. He had planned those bales for February. He mentioned it to Hector at the fence line in early August, not complaining exactly, just noting the fact, the way farmers note hard things. Hector said he was sorry to hear it. He did not mention that his own hay supply was untouched. The 2007 weaning weights came in at the Marshall sale barn in October, and Greta's calves from the native grass cows were the talk of the barn. Not because anyone knew the full story yet, but because the weights were unusual. The calves averaged 587 pounds at weaning, against a county average that year of 521 pounds. The difference was 66 pounds per calf at $1.18 per pound, which was $77.88 per calf. Greta had 73 calves to sell that year from the native grass cows. The additional revenue over the county average was $5,685. That was 1 year. That was before the conception rate advantage, before the reduced veterinary costs, before the hay savings from July. Dale Crowley bought several of those calves. He did not know whose they were until he saw the Salazar ear tags and asked the barn manager. The barn manager told him. Dale Crowley stood in the sorting alley with that information for a moment and then went on with his day. He did not go to the co-op that Thursday and say anything about it. His smile, when the Salazar farm came up in conversation, had gotten smaller. Let me tell you about the drought of 2009, because this is the reason the story is still being told. The winter of 2008 to 2009 was dry. The snowpack was thin. The spring rains were below average. By May, the soil moisture readings at Greta's weather station were already showing deficit. By June 15, the county had received 3.2 inches of rain against a historical average of 6.8 inches for the same period. The creek behind the Salazar South pasture, which ran year-round in normal years, stopped running on June 22nd. The pools in the creek bed shrank to puddles and then to damp gravel. The fescue pastures in Salem County went dormant in the first week of July. Not stressed, dormant, brown and flat, and producing nothing. Farmers across the county were feeding hay in July, which almost never happened, and making phone calls to hay suppliers in northern Missouri and Iowa, looking for anything they could get. The cattle were restless and losing condition. Some farmers were selling cows they had planned to keep, liquidating breeding stock because they could not feed them through a summer that showed no sign of breaking. Bud Thornton sold 30 cows in July. He sold them at distress prices because everyone was selling at the same time, and the market reflected it. He lost $18,000 on those 30 cows compared to what they would have brought in October. He did it because the alternative was watching them lose condition through August and September and sell for even less. Dale Crowley was busy that summer. He was buying distressed cattle from farmers who could not feed them, and he was reselling them to backgrounding operations in Nebraska that had better grass years. He was making money, the way certain kinds of businessmen make money in bad years, and he was doing it without pleasure because he had grown up in this county and knew these farms and these families, and watching them sell their breeding stock was not something he enjoyed regardless of what it meant for his margins. On the county road that ran along the Salazar South pasture, people slowed their trucks. The native grass pasture was green, not the pale, struggling green of something barely hanging on, a deep, living green. The big blue stem was chest high. The Indian grass was tasseling out in the heat. The cattle in the paddock were grazing calmly, unhurried, the way cattle graze when there is more than enough. Greta was rotating them every 2 days, resting each paddock for 16 to 18 days before grazing it again, and the rested paddocks were recovering fully between grazings because the root systems were pulling moisture from depths that the drought had not reached. The farm's fescue pastures were brown. Greta was not pretending otherwise. She had 160 acres of fescue remaining on the farm, ground she had not yet converted, and those pastures were dormant like every other fescue pasture in the county. But she had 220 acres of native grass by 2009, and those 220 acres were carrying her cattle through the worst drought in Saline County in 22 years, without a single bale of supplemental hay. She had planned for this. She had managed her stocking rate on the native grass acres conservatively, below what the pastures could carry in a normal year, specifically to build in a buffer for a year like this one. Dr. Voss had told her in their first email exchange that native grass managed correctly would carry cattle through a moderate drought without supplemental feed, because the root depth meant the plants were buffered against surface moisture loss. She had believed him. She had planned accordingly. And now the drought had come, and the plan was working, and her cattle were gaining weight in July while her neighbor's cattle were losing it. The weaning weights at October were the numbers that ended the argument. Greta's native grass calves weaned at an average of 601 pounds. The county average that year, depressed by the drought's effect on cattle condition across the board, was 489 pounds. The difference was 112 pounds per calf, at a calf price that had risen to $1.24 per pound because the drought had tightened supply. That was $138.88 per calf. Greta had 89 calves to sell from the native grass cows that fall. The additional revenue over the county average was $12,360 in a single year, in the worst drought in 2 decades. Her fescue calves from the 160 acres she had not yet converted weaned at 498 pounds, right at the county average. The fescue did what fescue did. She had the numbers in a spreadsheet on her laptop when Dale Crowley's truck came up the lane. Let me tell you about that afternoon, because it is the reason this story gets told the way it gets told. It was the second week of November 2009. The drought had broken in September, and the county was recovering slowly, the way it always does after a hard year. Dale Crowley drove up the Salazar Lane on a Wednesday afternoon and parked by the barn. Greta was in the barn office, which was a converted tack room with a plywood desk and a space heater, and the laptop and 6 years of notebooks stacked on a shelf. She heard his truck and came out. Dale Crowley was 63 years old by then, and the summer had aged him some. He stood by his truck with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the south pasture, which was brown now, the native grass having gone dormant in October the way it does, resting for winter, storing energy in those deep roots for the spring. He stood there for a moment without saying anything. Then he said, "I need to understand what you did out there." Greta looked at him. She had been waiting for this conversation for 5 years, and she had thought about how she wanted to have it, and she had decided that she was not going to be unkind about it because she did not think unkindness served anyone, and because she had not done this to prove Dale Crowley wrong. She had done it to keep her father's farm alive. She said, "You told me in the spring of 2004 that I was ruining the pasture. You said fescue had been working in this county for 60 years, and that native grass was for quail hunters." Dale Crowley's jaw tightened. He said, "I remember what I said." She said, "I'm not bringing it up to embarrass you. I'm bringing it up because the lesson isn't that native grass is better than fescue. The lesson is that any farm that grows only one thing is a farm that needs only one disaster to fail. Fescue works. It works fine in a normal year. But this county has had 8 significant drought years in the last 30. That's not rare. That's the pattern. And every farm in this county that ran on fescue alone was one dry summer away from selling their breeding stock." Dale Crowley was quiet. He looked at the south pasture again. He said, "How much did you clear this year over the county average?" She said, "Per calf, $139 times 89 calves." He did the math in his head. He said, "Jesus." She said, "Plus, I didn't buy a single bale of hay in July. Bud Thornton burned through 40 bales. At current prices, that's about $2,200 he spent feeding cattle that were losing weight anyway." Dale Crowley put his hands back in his pockets. He looked at the ground. He said, "What would it cost to convert? For a farm like Thornton's?" And this is the thing about Greta Salazar that you need to understand. She did not make him ask twice. She went into the barn office and came back with a folder she had prepared, not for Dale Crowley specifically, but because she had known that eventually someone would ask this question and she wanted to be ready to answer it well. The folder contained a conversion cost estimate for a typical 400-acre Saline County operation, broken down by year, with a projected payback period of 4.2 years under normal conditions and 2.8 years if the farm experienced a drought year in the first 5 years of the conversion, which, she noted, the data suggested was likely. She handed him the folder. He took it. He stood there, reading it in the November light by the side of his truck, and she watched him read it, and she did not say anything else. He looked up from the folder. He said, "Will you talk to some of the other farmers if I set it up?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Thornton's going to be hard. He's stubborn." She said, "I know, but he's also broke from this summer, and broke men listen better than comfortable ones." Dale Crowley almost smiled. It was a different kind of smile than the one at the co-op in 2004. It was the smile of a man who has been wrong about something and is beginning to understand how wrong, and who is deciding to do something about it rather than defend the position. He drove back down the lane. Greta watched his truck until it turned onto the county road, and then she went back into the barn office and sat down at the plywood desk and opened her laptop and started building the presentation she would give to the Saline County Cattlemen's Association in January. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because the story doesn't end in November 2009. The January 2010 meeting of the Saline County Cattlemen's Association was held at the Marshall VFW Hall, which seated about 80 people. Greta had expected 30. She got 71. Dale Crowley had made phone calls. He had not told people what to think about what they were going to hear. He had told them that they needed to hear it, and that was enough. She spoke for 45 minutes. She showed her 6 years of data. She showed the weaning weight comparisons year by year, with the county averages as a baseline. She showed the conception rate data. She showed the hay savings from 2007 and 2009. She showed the conversion cost model and the payback timeline. She showed a map of the farm with the native grass acreage marked in green and the remaining fescue in yellow, and she explained that she intended to complete the conversion over the next 3 years. The room was quiet in a way that was different from the quiet at the co-op in 2004. That quiet had been dismissive. This quiet was the quiet of people doing arithmetic in their heads. Bud Thornton sat in the third row. He had come in late and sat down without looking at anyone. He listened to the entire presentation without expression. At the end, during the questions, he raised his hand. He said, "What's the minimum acreage you'd recommend starting with?" She said, "Whatever ground you're least happy with, start there. Get 1-year comparison data on your own farm. The numbers will tell you what to do next." He nodded. He sat back down. By the spring of 2011, 4 farms in Saline County had begun native grass conversions. By 2013, it was 11 farms, covering a combined 1,840 acres. The Saline County Extension Office, which had not been particularly interested in native grass in 2004, published a management guide for warm-season native grass establishment in 2012 that cited Greta Salazar's farm data as the primary local reference. Dr. Voss drove up from Colombia in the fall of 2013 to look at the Salazar operation and walk the south pasture in October. The native grass dormant and brown, but the soil beneath it transformed. And he stood at the center of the field with his hands in his pockets and said, "This is what I've been trying to tell people for 30 years. Greta said, "I know. I was in your class." He looked at her. He said, "I remember. You sent me a lot of emails." She said, "You answered all of them." He said, "I did." He paused. "I should have come sooner." She said, "You told me what I needed to know. I just had to come home and do it." Hector Salazar attended the 2014 Saline County Cattlemen's Association meeting, at which Greta was the featured speaker for the fourth consecutive year. He sat in the front row, which was not a thing he did naturally, because he was a man who preferred the back of rooms. He had completed the farm's full conversion to native grass that fall, 640 acres, the last of the fescue killed and reseeded, a project that had taken 10 years from the first 100 acres to the last 80. His weaning weights that year were the highest in the farm's history. His conception rates had not been below 92% in 3 years. His veterinary costs had dropped by 60%. His hay consumption in summer was essentially zero. When Greta finished speaking, Hector stood up. He did not say anything. He just stood up, and the room watched him stand